I'm delighted to come after three friends, three formidable intellects. And I would have perhaps preferred to respond to some of the issues they had raised instead of sticking to my point, but two of them I don't see them, one of them I don't see him here, and I also have something to put on the table. So perhaps I will try to do that as quickly as possible and then perhaps respond to some of the issues raised. I think I will move straight away to the collateral psychological and cultural traits which parallel the disarray in global political economy about which we have talked both this morning and now too, to some extent. I do believe that there are three major psychological characteristics which mark our inner disarray or disorder, and which has become increasingly conspicuous. First is that what ails us is often a mystery to ourselves. We are buffeted by feelings, sentiments, and motives about which we have very little clue. Often you feel that the violence comes first, and the response to the violence or targets of the violence have to be found to fit the violence within you. It is not that you are carrying a predesigned form of violence, but it is that you want to be violent and find a target. I have here called it anomic violence. I was in China when one person went into a school and shot and killed a few kids in the school. And the Chinese response to it was really very, very, I would say, even inspiring, because for 3 days, in every break of the conference, and at lunchtime and in the evening, somebody or other would raise that issue, because they were absolutely shocked out of their wits. Whereas, if you have been seeing the newspapers of the last 2 weeks, President Obama has said that people in America has become benumbed to such situations. He used the word benumbed. And I think I will probably use the same expression from some of the violence in places like India too. So there is this kind of violence to which people get used to it. I have seen the same response in Pakistan. People have become used to some people getting killed every other day, and life goes on. There is also a widespread search for certitudes. Somewhere, somehow, cross-culturally, the certitudes, old certitudes of people are collapsing. Probably more people are coming into the sector where these certitudes are challenged. But this has not led to any robust skepticism. This has led to search for new certitudes. And my suspicion is this: many of the things which disturb us are a direct product of this search for certitudes. The rise of fundamentalism, the rise of terrorist movements, terrorist states, and even lone wolf individual terrorists can be often connected to a search for certitude, for a search for a world where everything is little more predictable, where you are not confronted with a meaningless world. So I will, perhaps keeping these in mind, talk of 4 traumata with which a huge section of the world live. And these are the 4 massive instances of violence that has taken place over the last 300 years. First was the discovery of the Americas and subsequent genocide of the indigenous people, which according to some people is perhaps the biggest genocide of all times. They mention a figure, some of them mention a figure as high as 100 million. The second is the African slave trade, perhaps arguably the first globalized trade humankind had tried, experimented with, which supposedly has, according to some, taken a toll of 6 million lives. But according to others, the figure goes up to 12 million. I think even that is a gross underestimation, for the simple reason that this doesn't take into account the families torn apart, the communities often destroyed, and the whole supply chain that was built up by these 4 continents slave trade. I called it globalized because 4 of the continents were involved in that. So that was the second. The third was modern colonialism. I particularly add that adjective modern to it because unlike the Spanish and the Portuguese colonialism, which primarily were exercises in brigandage and loot, though given a Christian veneer by the church for a while. The truly modern colonialism began with the French and the British. And this colonialism, for the first time, introduced the concept of civilizational mission, the white man's burden. In this form of colonialism, you are no longer interested only in how much money you could make, how much gold you could ship back to your mother country, or how many women you could keep captive in your house, exploit. This colonialism, for the first time, thought of entire cultures and civilizations in terms of, one, metaphor of the body. I will come to that, explain this. And second, the metaphor of history. The first involved that some countries were defined definitionally as something like apprentice societies. They were childlike and savage. Cecil Rhodes gave that name. We are meeting in the island of Rhodes. He derived his name from Rhodes. It's the synonym of that. Cecil Rhodes called them half savage, half child. The historical metaphor was this, that it was derived, basically, though I'm calling it historical metaphor, it was actually derived from Darwinian social evolutionism. In that idiom, there were no new strange unknown countries which has something to teach you, from which you could learn something about about nature, about human beings, about the social systems or their distinctive styles of creativity. All societies except the Western ones overnight became the past of Western societies. They are what we were once. And tomorrow, if you govern them well, they will become like us. So in one sense, you hijack their present, because that present has no autonomous existence. They are not a wonder that was created by the God you believed in, or they were your past, your history. And their future could not be anything but what you are today. So you became their future. And this is a way of hijacking somebody's both present and the future. And the past didn't exist in any case, they were all ahistorical societies. And they the fourth great traumatizing event were the two world wars. As the name indicates, they were also global in scope, and they are also the colonialism. You could historically define the end of colonialism as the ending of the Second World War. You can mark it as history. But history is not everything. Psychologically, that colonialism never ended, because first of all, the winners in the World War II included the imperial powers, and there was little challenge to the culture of imperialism. In fact, many of the successor regimes immediately began to model themselves after their former rulers. And only the color of skin change of the ruling elite. Otherwise, it remained more or less the same. It is in this world that the three kinds of violence I have mentioned earlier began incubating. And I think we are reaping the whirlwind today. Both Johann Galtung and Richard Falk have mentioned this and hinted at these changes, the kind of traumata the rest of the world have lived with over the last 300 years. And these traumata actually often came many years, if not decades, probably even centuries. In the case of American genocide, it came after nearly 200 years in the middle of the 20th century, because there was at that time no global media, and there was no way of these events making the full impact on the globalized middle class. Indeed, many of the genocides have remained invisible still today. The Indonesian genocide was discovered probably 3 years ago when the documentary The Act of Killing was released. Otherwise, it has no presence in the global public consciousness till only 3 years ago. It took place in 1960s. So this is the world in which we are staying, and this is the world which we have to negotiate. And what I would like to make, my main argument is this, that these traumata, this experience which people have internalized, indeed brutalize the victims. Indeed brutalize the victims, and that also has been spoken about by the earlier speakers, mentioned at least. But that is not the full story. It is brutalized, I am saying, because it has been pointed out, some scholars, Mahmoud Mamdani is one of them, who has pointed out that he has published a book called Victims Can Be Killers in the context of the Rwandan genocide, that where the victims themselves turn genocidal. And that brutalization is fearsome. But what about the perpetrators? What about those who were responsible for these 4 sets of violence, the main actors in the world? Did they not get brutalized in the process? What about their culture and algorithms of everyday life? Were they not influenced by what they have gone through and what they have done in the past? I do believe these traumata cast their shadows on that part of European and North American culture too. The European civilization shows it in many ways. I once studied the way, as they talked of the Indians after British colonialism, of the Indians as effeminate and childish. How the behavior towards women and children in Victorian England also began to change. These are parallel processes. As you think of the inferior races as effeminate, non-masculine, non-martial, you also begin to redefine womanhood in your own cultures. And as you think of other communities and cultures as childlike or childish, you began to children too, your own country, as apprentice adults who would require strict discipline, sometimes brutal discipline, and there are enough record of that in studies of childhood and histories of childhood available to us. So there is this part of the story too. I do believe the brutalization of the perpetrators too was as deep and as dangerous as that of their victims. And I think we are living in a world where these two sets of brutalized victims of violence, if I may call it so, victims of one's own violence and victims of others' violence, who together define the world in which we live. In this kind of world, there is not much space for alternative definitions of or alternative imaginations of a desirable society outside what exists. Because one of the motivating factors in public life and public culture becomes your attempt to equalize the other, equalize the other in their coercive abilities, in their capacity to be violent. Whether you are a victim or whether you are a perpetrator, because perpetrator is permanently afraid that whom they have oppressed will strike back. We are nurturing ideas of revenge. This is, I would say, the other side, the other side of the so-called realistic politics and realism-backed statecraft. And it is very difficult to break out of it. At the moment, India is also ruled by a regime which is very much a product of this culture. I start with this because many Indians have the habit of saying that they are fundamentalists. They're orthodox. They might have some orthodoxy. Some supporters may be orthodox. Some people may be fundamentalist. But that is not their main strength. Their main strength is this, that they appeal to the middle class, Indian middle class, and articulate middle class, because they promise a more masculinized, more martial, proper nationality for India, because Hindus, being the majority, are the fit subjects of being a nationality. They are the ones who talk of nationalism as a primary organizing principle of Indian nationality. And they are the ones who are fully committed to the Indian nation state uncritically. All three, I would say, is a gift of colonialism. Because these are groups, exactly the groups which never participated in the freedom struggle of India. These are exactly the groups which oppose the freedom struggle. They also killed Gandhi, by the way. That's another story. But now, this is the idiom which has held them to have access to power. And they want to make I might as well mention here the very interesting fact that the founder of this movement of Hindu nationalism, as it's called, Savarkar, was an atheist, not a practicing Hindu. Exactly as the founder of the Islamic nationalism, Muslim nationalism, was an atheist and not a practicing Muslim. It tells you something that this is the only part of the world where the main actors who are leading the fundamentalist movements are themselves not believers in the faith. They, in fact, both have a touch of contempt for their own faith. We had no belief in the religion for which they were fighting. This is a very unique situation. Both were committed to the idea of nation-state as formalized in the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. It is the European concept of nation-state. Though they talk of Hindu Rashtra, it is the European nation-state. European-style nationalism and European-style nationality they wanted. Savarkar hated Hindus. He considered them effeminate, irrational, illogical. He hated Gandhi because he thought Gandhi was a natural leader of these demasculinized Hindus and these bogus carriers of the idea of Indian nationalism. He wanted to organize them and militarize them and use the British rule as a pretext for getting rid of the Muslims from India. And Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the Pakistani nationalist, if I may call him so, was a classical liberal who wanted a constitutional state, but a Muslim majority nation state. For this, he was willing to mobilize Muslims on fundamentalist Islamic grounds with the help of the Maulvis and Mullahs. You can imagine Savarkar's hatred from the fact that he believed that the Hindu belief in cow as a sacred animal, a totemic animal if you like, was actually a superstition. I am saying this because I do believe that the kind of violence we are facing often comes from this kind of sources, because this kind of motivating factors is colored with their search for certitudes which otherwise is not available to you. And as people are inducted in the modern sector and become a part of massified society and push towards a more individualistic society, often they fall for this. Please do not forget that some of this massive genocide, the colonial genocides are not very well known because it took place over a very long time. But colonialism, many may not know that colonialism made two major contributions to human civilization. One was the concentration camp, which was discovered during Boer War, and one was use of famine as a means of a genocidal device, first tried out in Ireland by Britain, and one of the last of them was the Bengal famine in 1943. But I would not like to be entirely pessimistic, though pessimism is supposed to be the realistic self of optimists, according to some. But I would like to point out that despite these, I do believe there are signs of resistance in many spheres of life. First of all, you might have noticed that last 40 years, almost all the major global heroes, charismatic global heroes, for good or worse, have something to do with non-violence. Nelson Mandela, Aung San Suu Kyi, the Dalai Lama are examples, but one can give other examples which to people from India might seem very strange. Like, for example, the Polish trade union leader who later became the president. Lech Walesa. Now, Lech Walesa was they called him our Gandhi. One of these mustachioed, vodka drinking Lech Walesa wouldn't look very Gandhian, but that because people impute this quality of non-violence to him, because he won a non-violence battle. Same thing happened with Benito Mussolini, I beg your pardon, Benito Aquino in Philippines. So there is this, the long shadow of Gandhi fell on all of them. But it is an interesting part that whether they were Gandhian or not, in some ways people imputed to them Gandhian qualities because it was seen as a check against the brutalization all around. Secondly, there has emerged amongst the various voluntary movements and non-party political processes all over the world a new kind of critique of science and technology and the scientization of the arguments for violence. There have been attempt to find, in some extent, go back to the earlier support which was for public values. In fact, Tu Weibing has mentioned this too, in compassion. All societies derive its public values from mainly three sources I have found. Compassion, aesthetics. Japan is one instance where aesthetics is very salient in deriving our public values, and reason. For the first time after the Enlightenment, compassion, which was a marker of Christian values, came to be dissociated from public values. It was no longer supposed to be adequate guide for public life and statecraft. And aesthetics too was never seen as serious contender for the same status. It was never. Whole emphasis changed towards reason and scientific rationality. And this ultimately allowed a new kind of violence to enter the global public life. It has been, many people call it instrumental reasoning, but I think the adjective is not necessary. Absolute dependence on reason is absolutely corrupting too. And it is not an accident that some of the most violent regimes have always justified their violence in terms of 19th century biological theory, social evolutionism, public hygiene. Nazis used public hygiene too. And that. So there was a necessary, it was necessary to go back to values, which were backed by not only scientific rationality, but as a corrective to dependent on also compassion. Whether the aesthetics enters it or not is a different issue. I am not good entering that. And perhaps the limits of reason, which beautifully captured by Tu Ming's almost poetic invocation of spiritual, the spiritual part of our human self, as well as the idea of anthropokosmos. That's a new word I learned. Which, as a possible anchor for a new kind of ethical system which will stand against the growing tendency towards the brutalization of our public life. Probably I should end with a story which is one of my favorite stories of the limits of this kind of scientized violence. Is the story of Sir Francis Bacon, founder of modern science, the one who thought knowledge is power, one who declared knowledge was power. He wanted to find out what would happen if you force-fed a chicken with snow. Quite an innocent query and curiosity. I could have told him what would happen, what was my suspicion of what would happen, but he didn't believe in speculation. He wanted to find out through experiment. So one wintry evening, at his home at London, he went out to his courtyard when it was snowing and began to force-feed a chicken. The inevitable happened, the chicken died. But unfortunately, Sir Francis also caught pneumonia and after 3 or 4 days died. So there is a moral of the story is this, that there are built-in checks to the kind of dependence on only rationality, only reason, only experimental method, and scientizing human affairs. I can as well stop here, but I will like to make one final comment. This is particularly in the context of some of the issues which have come up. One is this, that one is the issue of what is the fear of diversity that has become an intrinsic part of this life. The more we lose diversity, the more we talk of multiculturalism. And many societies are expected to destroy their existing cultural plurality and then opt for multiculturalism as a correction of the imposed uniformity. So it's a very strange anomaly and strange contradiction, but that's the way it is. This fear of diversity comes because we expect certain common human norms, common ethical norms to pervade our global sphere. I think this is a misguided search because cultures differ dramatically and radically, and we have very little tolerance for radical diversities. There is a lovely slogan of the Zapatistas. They say, you must learn to host the otherness of others. Not the sameness of others, but otherness of others. I think it's a lovely sentiment because in some sense, it captures the spirit of the kind of diversity which has been part of the cultural repertoire of many societies traditionally, but now is being lost. Secondly, there's maybe one last point, that there is two kind of conflict, I would put it differently. There are two ways of looking at one's antagonists, enemies and friends. The Turkish psychiatrist Bamik Volkan thinks finding enemies an ally is an intrinsic part of a person's developmental history. We have to look for enemies and we have to look for allies. He's a psychoanalyst, but he will probably have to locate it in the developmental profile. But I would think that it depends also partly on your concept of the enemy. What is enmity and what is ally? The enmity is very important because we have lost that concept of enmity, because our concept of enemy is one who we would like to be annihilated. There is always an annihilatory fantasy behind enmity, particularly in the public sphere and particularly in nationalist ideology. Let me tell a very brief story to illustrate what I want and what I have to reject. In the Indian epic Ramayana, it has many vernacular versions. I recently found out that in a Kannada version, which is the language spoken in South India, not so well known, of the Ramayana, there is an episode which is also performed in the famous Yakshagana style, in the traditional theatre style in South India. There is this episode is like this: when the hero of the novel, Rama's wife is kidnapped by the demon king who stayed in Lanka, which is the present Sri Lanka. He has his allies, a monkey kingdom, and the monkeys build a bridge from the lowest part of India to Sri Lanka. And his army goes through that bridge, over the bridge to destroy Ravana and kill him and ultimately rescue Rama's wife, Sita. Now, in this story is only on that part of the episode when the bridge is built. The bridge is built and it has to be sanctified through a puja, a collective worship. And unfortunately, in that region, there is no Brahmin to sanctify the bridge. The only known Brahmin in the region is the demon king Ravana, the villain of the epic, and Rama's antagonist, who has stolen Sita. And they have to send him an invitation to come and lead the prayers, to sanctify the bridge. Now Ravana knows that if he comes, he could be killed. He is the arch enemy of Ram. And Rama knows that Ravan has to do the performance. So Ravana comes to them. Because as a Brahmin, because before becoming a demon king, he was a learned Brahmin. So he cannot refuse that invitation as a duty of, it's his Brahminic duty to do that puja. So he comes in disguise, but everybody knows who he is, because there is only one Brahmin in the region. And it does the puja and goes away unmolested. But then Rama's army goes there to defeat him and kill him. It is a different concept of enemy. Your greatness is defined by the kind of enemies you have, not by the kinds of friends you have. You can be careless about choosing your friends, but not your enemies. So that is a concept, I think, which the modern world has forgotten. Perhaps we will discuss at some time. Thank you very much for your patience.